It's great to be with y'all. What a wonderful place and space, isn't it? It really is. And first, I want to thank everyone here for being here today. I appreciate you, especially after you learned that this program was all about three white guys talking about the KKK. So, but in all seriousness, obviously, you know, our hearts are kind of heavy too with what's happened in Charlottesville. And I know Greg and I were talking about this earlier, and I'm going to, you know these guys, don't you? Anyway, Greg Iles, New York Times bestseller. Let's give Greg a hand. Anyway. And then Stanley Nelson, a good friend of mine, incredible journalist, Pulitzer Prize finalist, and now the author of Devil's Walking, which you're going to buy Greg's books, I know, please. But buy Stanley's book, too, because it's the true story behind a lot of what Greg's written about. So, anyway, but Greg, you and I were talking about, absolutely, give Stanley a hand. You and I were talking about Charlottesville a little bit before we got started, so go ahead and share whatever thoughts you have on that. I know it's been on your heart.
I just want to say something at the start, and then maybe a little something about Mississippi at the end. And it's my son goes to UVA. He wasn't there until right after. But normally when I've appeared with Stanley, and hello, 1 2 3, 1 2 3. Can y'all hear me now?
Yep.
1 2 3, 1 2. Here we go.
There you go. Mics.
1 2. Listen. All right. Will that work? Okay. All right. So I said my son goes to UVA. He didn't get there till right after the stuff. But normally when Stanley and I talk about this, or Jerry, the things that we write about, these Klan murders and the state of the movement in Mississippi and Louisiana in that period, we're talking in a historical context, normally. I look back with just tragic humor almost on the idea that when I started to write Natchez Burning after all these years, President Obama had just been elected and everybody was talking about America being a post-racial society. That just seems comical now, okay? And I just want us to realize that what Charlottesville showed us is that a thing that we thought would die off with generations, your grandparents' generation or whatever it was, has not done that. Racism and hatred and these things that drove the people who committed the crimes that Jerry and Stanley have spent a lifetime investigating, the thing that drove those people drove the people in Charlottesville. It exists in the body politic like a virus, and it's passed on from mother to daughter and from father to son. And that is the scary thing about it. It's not age-related. I ran into that when I rewrote the Natchez Historic Pageant, and I thought the problem would be the older women in the garden clubs, when in fact the older women have lived long enough and know how unfair it was and were ready for change. It was the 40-year-old women who have this nostalgic view of how things used to be, and they want it to be that way for them and their kids. That are the problems. So I think that America is about, in the next 2 or 3 months, to deal at long last with the unfinished business of the Civil War and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the movement. And it is going to be traumatic. People have already died, and I fear that more people will die. And I don't say that lightly. But we're all about to go through some things, and I think Mississippi has a special burden in that period. But we may get to that later. But I don't want us to come here and talk about 50-year-old murders as though we're ignorant that we're living in the midst of an existential crisis right now.
Stanley, anything you want to add to that? Any thoughts that come across your mind?
I just don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know. I just hope that we all think. How about now? I can't
Put it
closer to my mouth.
There you go.
Maybe we should just use them like handhelds. We'll just hold the little earpiece.
Yeah.
No, I was just saying, I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope we can think and be calm. And we really just need to think about our country and where we are. And that's the best I hope for.
Well, back to your books, Greg. You know, Mississippi Blood debuted at what, #1? New York Times bestseller? Yeah, all right. That's good stuff, yeah. And
Thank you. Let me say this.
Sure.
I joked with John Grisham. He and I had a drink after the event we had at Lemuria on his tour. And he was saying, you know, how well the book had done, Mississippi Blood and everything. But John and I came out with our first books only 1 year apart. And here he was congratulating me. And I said, John, yeah, it's nice, but I would have rather hit way back in '93 when you did, so I'd have flown here on a jet like you did.
So you're getting these rave reviews, and the one I loved the other day was the food critic from the New York Times, Sam Sitton, was urging people to sit down for a weekend with your entire trilogy and a bucket of chicken. So I love that. So what's it like to be Greg Iles these days?
Man, you know, I'm old, man. I said that on my tour, you guys. I'll just, as shortly as I can, I'll just say this. You know, when I started writing that trilogy, my kids were in middle school. I had 2 legs. I felt like a young man. You know, when I finished it, when that book hit #1, my kids were in college. I had 1 leg. I'm gray, white-haired, look like my father, man, and I'm tired. You know, when they called me and said, "Oh, your book made #1, aren't you so excited?" I mean, I was like, "Yeah, it better hit #1." Jesus. After all that, it took me 8 years, you know. But anyway.
So where did you get the idea for the trilogy? It's kind of fascinating because you've obviously dealt with this character before in your other books, but what made you decide to kind of do this and do it as a trilogy, or did you originally plan it as a trilogy?
Okay, I want to be conscious of compressing all this. I was trying to write this story as a single book. That's a foolish idea, and I should have known better, but I tried. I was a week from deadline, and I'd realized it was going to have to be at least 2 books. My publisher was very angry. That's when I pulled out on the Highway 61 and got hit by a truck going 70 and nearly died. So aside from breaking all those bones and having a torn aorta and being in a coma for a week, when I woke up out of that coma right over there at UMC, life just looked different, very, very different. And I realized laying in that bed that if I was going to write about race and Mississippi and family, that I wasn't going to pull a single punch. I was going to tell it like it was, and I didn't care who got angry, and I didn't care if the publisher wanted it or didn't want it. And thank you. Now, when I tell that story, people say they expect you like it's an Oprah moment, you know? They expect like, oh, you followed your bliss, and look what happened. It's how it all. No. As soon as I made that, it was my Jerry Maguire moment. As soon as I made that decision, I lost my publisher. I went 7 figures in debt in 1 day, and then lost my agent, and I was broke and broken to pieces. And that's where I started rewriting that trilogy. Now, it became a trilogy partly because the themes, I took them so seriously, and partly because of this guy right here, Stanley Nelson. I had always avoided writing about the Klan because what Jerry knows and Stanley knows, and it sounds foolish now, but in the mid-'60s, the Klan had mostly been seriously infiltrated by the FBI. Some of the top guys were on the payroll of the FBI. So to be writing thrillers about the 80s and the 90s and having the Klan be the bad guy, that's just foolish. And it falls into a stereotype that Yankees think about Mississippi that is not true. You know, and I should mention now about the Charlottesville thing and what's going on all over the country. I will not say this is a bright spot, but it is something that guys like us who study this understand. For so long, Mississippi has been the whipping boy for the nation on race, as if Mississippi is the worst place on earth. But black folks can tell you racism is everywhere. It is a national problem. And what Charlottesville and these other things have shown us going back to the shootings over the last 2 or 3 years, racism isn't a Mississippi problem. It's an American problem, okay? So at least we're starting to see that. Now, I lost my way a little bit. You just
Yeah, that's fine. Well, let's talk, Stanley. So tell the story of how you got looking into these cases. You were for those that don't know, tell about what your day job is and what you do as an editor and that kind of thing.
Editor of a small paper in Louisiana, in Faraday. Circulation of about 5,000. And I do everything you can imagine. I cover meetings and government and court. And one morning in 2007, we found out that the FBI and the Justice Department was going to take a second look at some old, unresolved murders from the Civil Rights era, and a man from Faraday named Frank Morris, his name was on the list. I had never heard of Frank Morris in my life. So I called the Southern Poverty Law Center, which was instrumental in getting the federal government to take another look at these cases. And they sent me 150 pages of heavily redacted documents. I took that little bit of information and I wrote my first story. It was about a little over 700 words. And I really thought, you know, this is interesting, a story, a story from the past, but I really didn't see how I could advance the story. But not long after the story was out, I got a call from Rosa Williams. She was the granddaughter of Frank Morris. And what happened to Frank Morris was he owned a shoe shop in Faraday, and he had owned that shop for 30 years. And he was able to operate with both a black and white clientele, and he was able to walk that racial tightrope from great skill in understanding the conditions of the era in which he lived. And one night, he heard glass breaking out in front of the shop. He was asleep in a back room. He goes to the front. He sees two men. One of them has a shotgun. The other one has a gasoline can. As he walks up to the front of the building, he tells them to stop doing that. One of them throws the match, and as he tries to escape the front door, the man with the shotgun points it at his head, tells him to get back in the shop. And I expressed that much more nicely than what that man did. Frank emerges from the back of the shop after several seconds. The clothes are burned off his body. He has burns 100% on his third-degree burns. It's horrible. 2 Faraday police officers pull up, take him to the hospital. He's there for 4 days. Before he dies, he tells an FBI agent, describes the men that attacked him. I didn't know all of this at first, but Rosa Williams, his daughter, calls and says someone from Faraday sent her a copy of the paper, and she said, I want to thank you for that article. She said, I've learned more about what happened to my grandfather in that one article than I've known in the last 40 plus years. And I found that just hard to believe. You know, how can that be? She said no one from authority had ever talked to her, that she had throughout her life wondered what happened to her grandfather. And she said, you know, I want to know who did it, but more than anything else, I want to know why they did it. What could he possibly have done for someone to want to kill him in that way? And it reminded me personally of a story of when I was a young person, and we came up on this horrible traffic accident, and we watched this young couple and their 7-year-old daughter burn up in this Volkswagen Beetle. And I couldn't get out of my head, how do you purposely set another human being on fire? And I talked to the owners of the paper. They own 3 weeklies, including the Concordia Sentinel. And I said, you know, we ought to really look at this. And they said, let's do it. And I'll give all the credit to that family. It's a family, the Sam Hanna family. And they let me work on this story for 10 years, more than 200 articles. And we faced a lot of abuse over time, but they hung in there. So that's how I got into it.
Yep.
Let me say one thing.
Yeah, please, go ahead, Greg.
What I meant to say, and what Stanley reminded me of, I avoided writing about the Klan all that time until I got to know Stanley, who had been working on these silver dollar cases about this secret terrorist offshoot cell of the Klan that had managed to evade arrest for 40 years. and didn't wear robes, didn't go to meetings, didn't do anything like that. They just hurt and killed people. And when I found out that these murders had happened a stone's throw from my house, and I had not known about them, then I knew I had what was going to be the external framework of my story. The core was going to be family, but the external framework. And Stanley, he is just a character. He is Henry Sexton in those books. He's right there.
Yeah.
And I had to kill him off. I hate that.
Yeah,
That was the part I was going to ask you about.
but let me say something.
Well,
I'm feeling much better now.
yeah, why does everyone kill off the journalists? That's what I want to know. Novels have an affinity for that.
Let me say something about these guys, too. This is funny, but it gets at reality, too. I'm pretty progressive and pretty liberal, and but I got to say, when Amazon was gung-ho making this thing into a series, now it's all on hold. I always get asked about this, so everything's on hold. But in the early days, it was all gung-ho to make a cable series of the trilogy. The first thing they wanted to do when they called me, the screenwriter called me and said, man, we've been thinking we want to make that Henry Sexton character black. And I said, well, I'll think about it. Let me call Stanley. so I had to call this guy who had spent years of his life pursuing these cases of these murdered black people and say, man, look, I think in the movie you're going to be black. Are you okay with that? But now here's the humorous part, but it also gets at the complexity of this stuff. The reality is the guys doing this work, pursuing these cold cases that the FBI gave up on long ago, are middle-aged white guys. They're not 25-year-old black grad students from Emory or wherever, okay? It's white guys. And that may not fit the narrative that Hollywood wants to tell, but that's the truth.
But it also makes it easier for us to go talk to the Klan guys, so I have to say that part.
It does.
Yeah.
But I think they deserve some credit for this, and I would hate to see that erased in the dramatic presentations
It's
of
okay.
it. But
I don't
these guys
mind.
are heroes right here, not me. I'm just, doing it.
Greg mentioned it, but let's talk a tiny bit more about it. Talk about the Silver Dollar Gang and what you found out. I mean, because that's just fascinating. We've known about the White Knights, the KKK, the most violent Klan organization in the United States, at least a dozen killings. But go ahead and talk about the
Just
Silver Dollar Gang.
A real brief history. In 1962, the original Knights were formed in Louisiana, in the Shreveport area. They based their constitution and their operation on the old Knights of the Ku Klux Klan from the 1910s and 20s, which had, at the time, 4 million members. So the original Knights quickly blankets the state of Louisiana, particularly North Louisiana and the southeastern part of the state, east of the Mississippi River. And so after that happened, by late 62, early 63, they start to move into Mississippi. And they start to form what they call claverins, etc. And not long after a presence is made in Mississippi, you have sort of a splintering or a rebellion or a coup, and that morphs into the White Knights. And you also had one other clan, the United Klan of America, and they were moving at the time west out of Alabama. So you had these three predominant clans. And the men that became members of the Silver Dollar Group had been members of these clans. Some of them continued to be members of those clans, but what they did was they realized after a while that rallies and wearing hoods and parading down streets and going to Washington or going down the streets of Natchez and having a big rally at Liberty Park really didn't do much for their cause, which was to stop integration at whatever cost. And so these men went underground. They continued to keep their membership in the regular clans, and what they did was the man that founded the group, their original members, he gave them each a silver dollar that was minted in the year of the Klansman's birth. That was their symbol of unity. And all of these men had experience on what is known as wrecking crews, and that's Klan hit squads that would go out, burn houses, businesses, whatever. And so the Silver Dollar Group was able, and the FBI did infiltrate the Silver Dollar Group, and particularly in 1967. But it was years later before any Silver Dollar Group members were ever prosecuted. And of course, one Silver Dollar Group member was James Ford Seal, who Jerry well knows. And the other one was a man named Claude Fuller, who was involved in the killing of Ben Chester White in Natchez in 1966. Right.
One of the important things y'all should get into is that Stanley's work exposed, I think, and Jerry's too, I'm sure, is the nexus between the Klans and law enforcement.
Yeah.
If you want to know what black people were facing in the 60s, it wasn't just neo-Nazis running out in the street, easily identifiable. It was that the guys that you were supposed to go to for help were the Klan.
Yeah, the Meridian Police Department in Meridian, Mississippi, for example, the estimates I've heard from the guys who were in Meridian Police Department is that there were more than half those guys were in the Klan, including the main shooter in the Mississippi burning case. His brother was a police officer. So there was a pretty close relationship between Klan and law enforcement in those days, and then sympathizers on top of that. So, Greg, back to you. Natchez burning is almost 800 pages. Bone Tree is more than 800 pages, and Mississippi Blood is what? 700 pages.
The whole thing's like 2,300 pages.
Yeah, and Stephen King said he wished Natchez burning was longer. What was he thinking?
He's about as crazy as I am.
Talk a little bit about the band, because I'm curious about that. Tell me about the Rock Bottom Remainders.
Man, I see we're being filmed back there. Who else? I don't want to say too much on camera. It's one of those, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Yeah, I play in a little charity rock and roll band with Stephen King, Amy Tan, Scott Turow, Dave Barry, Matt Groening of The Simpsons, Roger McGuinn from The Byrds, Ridley Pearson, Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Maury. So it's comedy, it's fun. About 4 of us are serious musicians, and the rest suck worse than you can possibly imagine.
Well, you were actually going down the road to being a rock and roll guy, weren't you?
Several of us were, really. Except Mitch Albom played in the Greek Cafe for years for money. Ridley Pearson was in a rock band. Dave Barry was in a band. So, let me tell you, being a rock star is way more fun than writing books. I'm telling you. That's why, given the choice, you can sit at home in a room by yourself, type in 18 hours a day, or we can go out to House of Blues in Chicago and have women throwing geriatric panties at us. And I'm going to quit there without talking about any of my bandmates or anything else. But we've had a lot of fun. We get to do things. It's all for children's literacy, but we get to play places like Google headquarters and outdoor gig at UCLA, and just meet a lot of cool people. It's the good part of. All right, I'll say one quick thing. I'll say. All right, people ask you. I remember asking Glenn Ballard from Natchez when he's a music producer. He's working with Michael Jackson, and I remember asking Glenn, "Man, do you feel like you've made it now?" And Glenn looked at me like I was crazy, and he said, "Man, in this business, you never think that way, And here he was writing "Man in the Mirror," Yeah. And then I sort of have found that to be true as well. But I do have a moment where I feel like I made it, which was that when I got asked to sit in with the Rock Bottom Remainders in New York, I did that. And at the end of the gig, somebody goes, "Hey, man, you going to the after party at Amy's Loft?" And I'm like, "I don't know, I guess." And so this is like Amy Tan's Soho Loft or whatever. So an hour later, I'm in Amy Tan's loft with a whole bunch of best-selling authors, and I'm drinking way too much wine, and I'm in the corner with Scott Turow asking him if the affair the guy had in Presumed Innocent was something that he really did in real life. And I thought, I have made it, man. This is where I want to get.
I can't top that. That's good. So, Stanley, obviously there's been a lot, there seems to be even now still continue to be a growing interest in kind of these civil rights cold cases. And why do you think that is? I mean, it seems like the interest continues to grow as opposed to kind of fade. And now, of course, we've got the Till bill that added another 10 years now that we could look at cold cases up through, I guess, 79. But why do you think that is? Why do you think that there's such an interest in these cases?
Well, you know, you've got just so many unsolved murders in so many communities that people really maybe knew something happened and didn't know exactly what. And you also have young people today that, and Jerry, we talked about this before, when you start to talk about that era, you have to say, well, let's go back to a time that you know absolutely nothing about.
Right.
Because if you can understand that time, you can have a little bit better understanding of what's going on now and why we still have all of these unresolved issues. So I think all of that plays together. And then if you live in a town where someone was killed and you don't know who did it and why, and it's still there, because I can tell you something, I've covered primarily black families, but I covered white families as well. One particular guy named Earl Hodges from Franklin County, Mississippi. Right. These families are devastated from these events, and it's generational. It doesn't stop. It doesn't go away. There's always a wondering of who did this and why, where are those people, how did they live their lives out? And there's also a wondering with the family, does anybody really care about us at all? Does anybody have any interest in what happened? And as I say in the book, and I always, you know, we all have a responsibility in the communities in which we live. We have to be involved in what happens, and we have to take part. Whatever that, we all have a role that we can play. Jerry and I and Greg can write about it, but, you know, we all can do something. I don't know what that is, you know, you just have to figure it out, but we can all do something. And one thing that used to get to me is people would say to me, why are you stirring all of these things up? You know, why are you doing that? And then quote me a verse from the Bible. And, you know, I got to thinking, so one day I was in church one day, and I just opened up to Proverbs, and I came to Proverbs 28:17 that says, a man who is laden with the guilt of human blood will be a fugitive until death. Let no one support him. And to me, that means that, of course, murderers are always looking behind their shoulder, and that if we know something, we have I think, a moral responsibility if something happens in our community. I think our silence supports those kind of things. We have to stand up and do something.
Amen. I was going to quote something you had in your book. It's actually a quote from Robert Penn Warren. For the truth is a terrible thing. You dabble your foot in it, it is nothing, but you walk a little farther and you feel a pull you like an undertow or a whirlpool. First there's the slow pull, so steady and gradual you scarcely notice it, then the acceleration, then the dizzy whirl and plunge into darkness. For there is the blackness of truth too. And this kind of reminds me of your novels. And, you know, you've obviously been a best-selling author for a long time, but what's interesting to me is since you've written this trilogy, at least my opinion, your work's getting taken very seriously now, and I don't know, why do you think that is?
It's put me in a quandary, honestly, because for whatever reason with this trilogy, with that decision I made to tell the truth about everything, suddenly I'm getting to places and they're introducing me as a real writer, whatever that is, or the next Pat Conroy, or the whatever. And so now I find myself having to deliver another book, and most people, like publishers and agents, whatever, expect you to go right back to writing some, you know, just thriller. And it feels very weird to do that. I'm not sure I really can do that anymore. And I want to point out one little dark irony of what Stanley said. You know, when people say the most common refrain for these guys and even me is, why you want to drag all that stuff up, man? You just ain't going to do nobody no good, you know, just on and on, right? But isn't it ironic that the same people who are telling us not to drag up that history are usually the same people saying, you can't erase my history, man. You can't get rid of that. You're going to erase my history.
I will share one story myself. Talking along those lines is I had I was writing about the Mississippi burning case, and I had this lady call, and I'd written a story about Cecil Price, who was the deputy sheriff who's basically involved in the killings of these three young men, three young civil rights workers were killed by the KKK, bodies taken out and buried 15 feet down. A miracle that they were ever found. I mean, you know, and someone ratted, and that's how they found out. But anyway, this woman called me and was complaining about story, and so we just kind of kept talking, and I think that's what Stanley does a great job of too, is just listening to people, right? You know, whatever they want to say. And I just let her keep talking, and then she revealed that her own daughter had been murdered. And I said, well, whatever happened? You know, was there a trial? What had happened? And she said, oh, the guy that she believed did it was acquitted, which of course means he can't be retried for murder. And so she was complaining about this, and she was saying, well, I just don't, you know, well, I said, well, what if that guy could be tried again for murder? Would you be for that? And she said, well, yeah. I said, don't you think these families feel the same way?
Yeah.
And it was fascinating to me that that never crossed her mind, you know. So it's interesting. It's a matter of perception sometimes. Do you ever relax? I mean, every time I get in contact with you, you're working, man.
I hadn't taken a vacation in 8 or 10 years. I don't know how to relax. I've forgotten how. I don't know why. I'm not complaining. You know, life is good. But
are you working on another book? What's the latest?
I'm supposed to be working on. That's what I always say. You know? I always lie and tell the publisher it's going great. You know, and now I just said that on camera. But again, something you said and Stanley said reminds me. You know what these guys do? You can sit here and talk about a murder, a this, a rape, a murder, a arson, or whatever. In your mind, you just catalog it. You don't process it. You don't get it.
Right.
You don't feel it. But when I talk to Stanley, the things I get from him are when Frank Morris, who became Albert Norris in Natchez Burning, this is what Stanley tells me. And then he forgets it, but he knows it and he uses it. But for me, this is what makes it live for people. And that is when Frank got out of the back of his store and he was first seen, it looked like a snowfall around him in the light. You know what that was? It was his skin. Particles of his skin floating in the air. When he got to the ER, and they just dumped him at the ER, right? They didn't take him in the ER. They just threw him out, burned on 100% of his body. The nurses remembered nothing, a trail of bloody footprints from the door all the way to where he ended up. Indelible. But the final thing, and nobody has seen this except Stanley, myself, a lawyer, maybe a couple people. There's something I think should be seen, and this is up to Stanley. His publisher didn't want to do this. When Frank Morris lay there dying in the hospital and would not name his attackers, no matter who asked him, even to his friends, the FBI, whoever, a black Catholic priest sneaked into the room with a camera, and he shot a series, you talk about guts, to sneak past those cops. And he shot a series of pictures of Frank lying in the bed. And when you see Frank Morris before the attack, he's a good-looking guy, thin-faced. When you see these pictures, it's a black man lying in bed, and his head looks like a bowling ball, double size. And there's a pair of folded hands by him. It is every bit as shattering as the photo of Emmett Till. Right. But the difference, as Stanley says, is Emmett Till was dead. Frank was alive. And you got to see stuff like that. People just don't understand it. And I can try to make it live. And again, you're back to well, what's the point of bringing all that up? But all you have to do is watch what happened in Charlottesville to see there's every reason in the world to bring all that up.
But the thing that I think in my mind, and Stanley, feel free to weigh in on this, the thing that makes these cases different in my mind is it's not just that these guys got away with murder. It was the fact that everybody knew they got away with murder. I mean, everybody knew Byron D. LeBecq was shot in Medgar Evers. It wasn't a secret. these Klan guys that were involved in the Mississippi burning case. I mean, everybody knew who they were, the deputy and the sheriff and everyone. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, but I just, I want to make this point. In my particular cases that I covered, Southwest Mississippi and Louisiana, the FBI really did a really good investigations and left through their records a good blueprint of what we do today. I was surprised to just see how thorough that was. And now the federal government came back in, prosecuted James Ford Seal, prosecuted Ernest A. Vance, some other prosecutions. But here's the thing. For 50 years, these cases have been unsolved in every county, parish, town, and whatever, and there's been a series of sheriffs and district attorneys whose responsibility it is to solve those crimes because they happen in jurisdiction. And it doesn't matter if it happened 10 years ago or 50 years ago. And I think that's what we as a public have to recognize. Ultimately, this lack of justice is everybody's fault, because we elect the people that serve us. We forgot about those crimes. We can't throw it all on the FBI and the Justice Department. And I'm talking about people who have served, men, women, black, white, who are in office today and who have been in office. We all are responsible.
Well, I was going to ask you about journalism, Stanley. I mean, obviously, our profession has been maybe a little criticized these days. So.
Yeah.
And so I was just going to get your thoughts about the field of journalism, and would you advise someone who's young to go into journalism these days?
When I really got interested in journalism was in the 70s when Woodward and Bernstein were covering Watergate. That's when journalism schools just went out the roof. And I think you're probably going to see that now. In some ways, it's good to be a reporter. The Center for Investigative Reporting is getting wonderful donations now. You'll see grants being given to different various groups. So reporting, and I'm going to tell you the other thing is, Jerry and I have talked about this. Internet's wonderful, cell phones are wonderful, all of these things are wonderful, but you still have to get out and go knock on doors and find people, and that's the legwork, and that's what we really need from good reporters, is to get out there in the communities. Because you can't do everything on a telephone and in front of a screen. You have to be out wherever. You have to find people and look it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is such a thing still known as the library.
Yes, there is.
I mean, and a lot of the work that you and I do, I mean, you actually had to go back and look at these old newspapers that may be on microfilm and other things like that.
Look in courthouses and follow Klansmen. You can follow Klansmen from property they owned and where they lived, and you can find relatives that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Lots of ways.
Yeah, who all lived on that block at that particular time.
Right.
Things like that. Anyway, anything else you want to add, Greg, to this?
Are we at the end? Or
I was going to take questions, so anybody that has questions, but anything else you want to add? Any other thoughts?
I kind of do, but I don't want to take questions about it.
We'll save you. How much time you want? 5 minutes?
No.
5 minutes at the end?
minutes.
2 minutes at the end?
Minutes, yeah.
Okay, we'll save Greg 2 minutes at the end. And so we're at the point where we're happy to take questions. I know these guys would love to answer. Anybody have a question? Nobody?
Hi, is this on? Okay. I've read your books for many, many years, and the trilogy was something to me that was quite removed from what I was used to reading from you, and it really opened my eyes in a lot of ways. I'm a Mississippi native. I've lived here all my life, and I'm just curious. I think all of us have something that we're very passionate about in our lives. How did this become your passion?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Natchez, Mississippi. You know, my daddy was Tom Cage. My daddy treated all those black folks and hardly charged anybody, and went through his life very angry about the way things were. He had served in Germany. He had seen what happened after the Holocaust, and they didn't drill it into me, but I just grew up with an awareness of what was going on around me. And I write the kind of books where you kind of need to wait for some people to die before you start saying too much. So that's one reason it took that long. But I mean, if you live in the South, it's in all our blood. We know about these things. You could say, well, I didn't know this, I didn't know that, but you know, and it was time to deal with it. I mean, once I nearly died, I realized the time you have to say something and make a difference is finite. And what Morgan Freeman has read says in Steve's movie, Shawshank Redemption, is the truest thing you will ever hear. Get busy living or get busy dying.
All right. Any other questions?
Yes, I was looking at the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map last night online, and they identified about 4 Claverns here in Mississippi. And I just have an interest. I just moved from Portland, Oregon, so a very different body politic, obviously. But my mother's from the South, so it's not foreign to me entirely. My family's had a business here in Mississippi for 6 generations, so I have an interest in knowing your opinion about the safety and the threat that they may still pose, if at all. And I also have a gay daughter in Portland who's afraid to come visit me here. So
I only heard half of that, man.
Yeah, I think you're talking about hate groups in Mississippi. We, like I said, I think it's 21. I think they have cataloged or something like that. Southern Poverty Law Center is cataloged, which is pretty similar to Louisiana. And Louisiana has about the same number. I'm kind of like Stan and I talked about this before. It's kind of like the guys that are marching are not the guys to worry about. It's the guys maybe that aren't marching sometimes, you know what I mean? I mean, those are the ones that I had Byron D. LeBeckwith tell me one time when I was talking to him, and he was talking about all these marches, these Klan marches and stuff like that, and he said, he was quoting somebody else, but he said that the Klan needed to stop acting like a tank and start acting like a submarine. And that's kind of the way he thought about it, that they needed to be silent, as kind of Sam Bowers talked about in his speech, to work silently at night, and that was when they were supposed to carry out their violence, was under the darkness of night and things like that. So the Klan back in the 60s, to kind of put it in historical context, depending on whose estimates you want to use, the FBI estimated up to about 10,000 Klansmen in Mississippi during the 1960s. They carried not just that, but also, that was the FBI. The Klan itself, their estimates were about, the White Knights were about 100,000. And they definitely had political power, because I've talked to some of these Klan guys who actually met with, you know, various politicians or whatever. And there were some politicians that were secret Klansmen as well. Today, obviously, that's not the same. And so we don't have, fortunately, they don't have the political power that they had back in those days. But obviously, we need to, given what happened in Charlottesville, these are things we need to watch and watch over time. I don't know of any direct threats at this moment in time, but I'm just saying it's something we need to monitor and watch. Anything else you want to say about that, Stanley?
I think it is sort of like, I worry a lot more about a silver dollar type person today than I would just to, I mean, when you walk in the streets like what happened the other day, and you see how they have weapons and clubs, that's very scary, but you can see their faces. You can identify and know who they are. If they have a Facebook page, at least they are identified in some way. I worry about the people who do not need that attention, those cameras, who walk down the streets and they want everybody to see them. I worry about those, but I worry a lot more about the silver dollar type.
All right. Hang on a second. We got a microphone we'll bring to you.
Hi. You've talked about telling it like it is. Has there been any backlash for telling it like it is?
Not worthy, not the kind you fear. The story I tell, and I'll tell it very quick. I wrote The Quiet Game was my first Penn Cage book, and in that book was a guy named Judge Leo Marston, who's one of the most reprehensible characters I ever created. And he was sort of based on a guy. That's all I really need to say here. But the guy was a very prominent judge. He's dead now, or I wouldn't even say this out loud. I was convinced he was going to sue me. He wound up on the Mississippi Supreme Court. I mean, I was worried, right? And because this guy's bad in this book. And so the book comes out, and as soon as it's out, I start getting phone calls from people going, man, is that Judge Marston? Is that so-and-so? I'm like, oh, hell no. No, that's not him. You know, I'm denying it left and right and everything. And then I hear, I'm scared to death I'm going to get sued. And about 2 months later, I hear that this judge is going all over Mississippi bragging that he's this character. So we live in this perverse age where, like any kind of fame, they'll take it, you know? It's nuts. Society's nuts.
Anything you want to say about that, Stanley?
No,
I mean,
that's a pretty good point. I mean, yeah.
Stanley, what I'd love for you to say where you went to college, I do want you to say about any pressures on the newspaper. This is your profession, as well as on you personally to not write what you have been writing.
Who's that for me?
Who's that for? Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Is there any pressure on you not to write what you've been writing? And also say where you went to college.
Wait, say where you went to college.
Louisiana Tech in Ruston, Louisiana. There you go. Yeah, there was pressure. You know, we had a little bit of advertisement pressure early on, but not that much. When we were really getting close to identifying a suspect in the Frank Morse murder, our office was broken into. Had a guy try to run over me 2 days in the morning while I was walking. You know, and you get cussed out a lot, but if you work for a newspaper, you don't get cussed out at least once a week. You're really not doing your job. But it's nothing like what it was. I can only imagine what it would have been like in the 60s when you were writing these things. But yeah, you can't do this kind of stuff without really upsetting some people to the core. And you know, you just can't let it bother you. Yeah. I asked an agent, an old FBI agent one day named John Pfeiffer, who recently died, and he worked in Concordia Parish for 10 years at the height of all the problems, and he carried his pistol in his suit briefcase. He didn't wear it on him. And I asked him one time, I said, are you afraid? Were you ever just afraid, you know, of any situation? He said, you know, I really wasn't. And he said, the reason was, for me, he says, I always, when you know that you're doing the right thing, there's a certain confidence, a certain peace that comes over you. You don't think about the bad things that might happen. You think about the good things that might come out of what you're doing. And I always sort of held on to that.
Excellent. Very good. Question? Right there. Wait.
Thanks, Greg. You and John and Nevada have been quite an inspiration for me through the years. We went to a meeting with y'all at MC or somewhere once before. I'll tell you a story. 2 years ago with John Grisham sitting up there, he inspired me to do some self-publishing. You know, I've been an old-time writer, never tried anything to do with it. Here's what's happened to me. I did a trilogy, and I'm halfway, about this close to the end of the second book, and I had this great crescendo ending to it to set up the third book. My editor goes online, when are you going to give me something else? Last 2 weeks, my crescendo ending now is boring. I mean, it's a political thriller. And what's hit me since the instance you talk about is, I'll tell you a quick story, then I'm going to ask you a question. I grew up in Vicksburg, and the time you're all discussing, as a Catholic school kid. And I was at a little Catholic school, 20 of us little boys, and in the 5th grade, this other guy came in, and we were playing drums, and I went to his house with him, and I didn't know he was a Jew. His mother had to explain to me that the KKK not only hated the blacks, right, but they hated the Jews and the Catholics. And my world went upside down because now I realized what was happening to me. And, you know, it was time during the film that Help was filmed. We weren't that. Our mothers had to go to work so we could pay bills and stuff, and the black women came in. And my question is, that cathartic thing has just been, I can't finish my other work now. And it's like you said, it's like, Is there a potential past, a cathartic experience to write from that other side, not the violent, the press, but the people that walked up watching this stuff going on? You go to school, ask the priest and the brothers, and they tell you, no, all that's wrong, but you're watching family members participate in it. I just don't know there's a market past a cathartic experience is what I'm asking.
Is that a question? No. Yeah. No, I think you took care of it right there. Only reality will tell you if there's a market for that, you know.
I have a lot of specifics rambling around in my mind, but I'd like to at least try to do it in a general way rather than deal with specifics. We're surrounded here outside symbolically with the Capitol building and several religious institutional buildings as such. And like you said, Mississippi gets a lot of licks as such, and I guess the church does too, and synagogues do too. I'm proud to say that I knew well the rabbi who was at the synagogue here in Jackson area during that time, Rabbi Perry Nussbaum, a very good friend. And to know that one of the things that he did was, unbeknownst to a lot of people, in addition to having the synagogue and his house both bombed, he used to make weekly trips up to Parchman and serve as a communicator to families with contact with the people who were there as well as there with the people back home. The other day I heard reference to the fact that the clergy stood alongside on one side, and on the other side there was a cross and a chant that said, "No more Jews." I'd like, in a general way, how you see religion playing a part of the climate in which we live today versus the climate of the 60s.
Well, I mean,
Good.
think about the 19-teens and the 1920s.
The KKK.
The big rise of the KKN was as an organization that was anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. That was the
And
big driver.
anti-Jewish.
And anti-Jewish. So,
Yeah, it's
There you-
just,
I mean-
history goes in circles. I mean, unfortunately, and so I think, unfortunately, that's what we're. There's long been this thread of white supremacist belief that way back to the Klan, like we're talking about way back in the teens and 20s, where it's anti-Semitic. It's essentially this kind of conspiratorial belief of, well, the Jews are, you know, that kind of happened during the Civil Rights Movement. It was like the Klan first started attacking African Americans. About midway through the 60s, they go, oh, the Jews must be putting them up to us. So then they started attacking the Jews. So, you know, Jack Nelson wrote a great book on that called Attack on Terror, which is about that in Mississippi. And so that's historical, and it dates way back before even the Civil War, that those kind of things, that anti-Semitic thread, that belief in this kind of grand conspiracy. It's people who believe in grand conspiracies, and that's part of one of those things that they seize on. And you heard that with the crowd when they marched the other day, as you mentioned. And so, unfortunately, it hadn't gone away. And you want to say something, wrap up with something?
I know everybody's walking out and everything, and I should probably just keep my mouth shut, but I'm going to say what I'm going to say. And look, we're heading into some tough times, I think, as a country. We're long past dealing with all this stuff. It goes all the way back to before the war, and by that I mean the war, the Civil War, and all the way through the movement. And what I'm about to say, let me preface it by saying this. I'm the direct descendant of two Confederate combat soldiers, a Louisiana cavalryman and a South Carolina infantryman. My uncle fought the Germans at the bridge at Remagen. I went to Ole Miss. I ran the rebel flag in the Natchez pageant. If I'd been alive in 1865, I'm sure I would have fought for the Confederacy. Now, that's the preface. But I'm also the guy who, with John Grisham, organized just about every writer in Mississippi, and Archie Manning and Morgan Freeman and Jimmy Buffett and the SEC coaches, to get rid of the damn flag once and for all. all I'll say about that, I can give you a dozen arguments. I talked about it on Statehood Day at the old Capitol, but we talked about detail. Imagine for a minute you are a black Mississippi National Guard soldier, and you are being asked to train and serve underneath the battle flag of an army that existed solely to keep your ancestors in slavery for all time. That is immoral. It is obscene. That is not acceptable, okay, on a human level. Second, I want to talk about the monuments just 1 second. There's a lot of feelings about the monuments right now, and let me tell you, I've walked every foot of Gettysburg, from Little Round Top to the wheat field to the peach orchard. My dad has more Civil War books than anybody in Mississippi. I know the whole history argument. But let me tell you where we're headed. We're going to see this within 2 weeks. A black boy and a black girl or some young white college kids are going to get arrested somewhere for pulling down or blowing up a Confederate monument. And then they're going to go to trial, and they're going to be looking at jail time. And the United States of America is going to be looking at its law enforcement authorities possibly sending black kids to jail for blowing up a monument to people who wanted to keep them in slavery forever. That is not going to fly. The monuments are going to go away, y'all. It's never going to be 1950 again, and it's never going to be 1850 again. It's just over. And everybody's going to have to adjust to it in their own way. But for God's sake, as a white Mississippian, speaking to white Mississippians, let's don't be the last ones clinging to the flag and the monuments. Because, folks, we've been last in everything for so long, I can't remember. And if we keep clinging to that crap, we're going to be last for 75 more years, and you might as well just give it up and move away. That is the hard truth. So please don't do it. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat or whatever you are. Don't elect short-sighted people with character insufficient to the historical moment in which we find ourselves. Rise above it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Ed.